both personally and corporately on our organizations. That'll be next Thursday at 10 o'clock. And then next Thursday at 11, announcement forthcoming. Next Tuesday at 10, we'll be talking about project employment issues and COVID-19 landscape. So announcements will be coming out on those very shortly, either today or over the weekend, and you can feel free to register. These are free, and these are provided exclusively to our CURT members, and as a response, obviously, to what we're all trying to manage. I'd like to also thank our staff, Greg Palmer and Kyle Costco particularly, who've worked to pull these things together quite quickly. We're all working remotely, and that has been a challenge. So thank you to the CURT staff. Thank you for your CURT membership and your continued participation. Let's move right into this. The three presenters today are Gary Bollert. We also have Brian from Saul Ewing, Brian Perlberg, who is with Consensus Docs. We have Brad Gordon, Senior Vice President and General Counsel of Gilbane, from a contractor's perspective. Before we get started, just a couple of quick logistics I'd like to have you pay some attention to. Number one, make sure that your video and your audio are muted. You can find those at the very bottom of your screen. Be careful not to hit the red telephone receiver button.
We just lost your video. We just lost your audio, Greg.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. Also on the upper right hand, you will find a chat box. We'd ask that you ask the questions on the chat box. The chat box is also in full view of our presenters, so they can take your question during your presentation or perhaps in the Q&A time period, and we will make sure that your question gets answered by our presenters. You'll receive a copy of the PowerPoint slide deck that they're presenting as well. Again, it is 11:05. We thank you for joining, and we're going to move right into the content. I'd like to introduce Gary Bollert, who is going to be leading our discussion today. He's going to be kicking us off. He is partnered with Saul Ewing. A full bio data sheet was made available earlier and will be made available subsequently in a follow-up communication. At this time, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Gary Bollert. I'm going to mute, and Greg Palmer, I think, is going to take over our slide deck at this point. Stand by. Gary?
Yeah. Greg and all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. It's kind of remarkable to think that it was only about a month ago that a lot of us were down there in sunny Chandler, Arizona at the CURT National Conference. And I think of all the things we did, playing golf together, those large cocktail parties and social events, listening to Arnaban tell us how rosy, or at least the forecast for 2020 looked good economically, and maybe there were some clouds on the horizon for 2021. But here we are, only about a month later, and our whole world has been turned upside down. As we heard President Trump say when he declared a national emergency, that those were two big words. Well, the two big words we're going to pick today to focus on and how it impacts our industry are the words force majeure. Greg, can you go to the next slide, please? Okay. We've got some bio information for myself. We've got Brad Gordon, which I'm real happy to have today, from Gilbane. He's going to talk to us from the front lines. Brian, a lot of you know him from AGC and also the Consensus Docs, is going to really educate us on what our contracts contain and how we should handle the concept of force majeure. Well, let's kick this off. And I'm going to say, pardon the French, if I may, but force majeure is our topic. And the reason I say that is force majeure, it's a French term. It comes out of the Napoleonic Code. And what it really means is superior strength or superior force. Something that we really didn't contemplate, and something that's really a very impactful event on a construction or infrastructure project. The next slide shows that on construction projects, what's important to recognize is that force majeure, it is not a common law doctrine. It's not something that exists out there in the law. Now, I'll talk later about a couple exceptions. Some states have statutes, but this doctrine is codified, if at all, and it's going to be in the contract provisions of your contracts. It was really great at the conference when we heard Dan Gilbane talk to us about that huge project down in Mexico that they did with their partner for Constellation. And I remember Dan saying, gosh, we put a lot of time into our contracts, and but once we got to the project, we put them in a drawer and we all worked as a team. Well, I'm going to ask you, and I think my colleagues today on this presentation are going to ask you to pull those contracts back out of the drawer, because they're important when it comes to this topic of force majeure. What those contract provisions are and what they're going to do is to have a force majeure event. It's not just that we have a big issue that we're dealing with. What we have to look for is provisions that describe events that cannot be anticipated or controlled, which prevent fulfillment of bargained for obligations, and there's really no reasonable steps to prevent or mitigate the event. Now, just to understand that a little better, can't be anticipated or controlled. I suppose if you took everybody in the world, everybody, everything could be anticipated, whether it's by a science fiction writer or otherwise, but that's not what we're talking about. Take, for example, a hurricane. Those that you work on the Gulf Coast, would you anticipate a hurricane hitting the Gulf Coast? Yes, that's foreseeable. Would you anticipate a hurricane with force winds such as Katrina or Rita, which were declared national emergencies? Probably not. So it has to be in that type of category of event. It has to prevent your performance. It can't really be something that, darn, this thing got more expensive to perform because now I have to go to another supplier. Or maybe my labor costs are going up, or my productivity isn't what I planned in my bid. Those really aren't what we're talking about. It has to prevent the essence of your ability to go forward. And there's no reasonable steps to mitigate or prevent the event. And we're going to talk in a minute about these closures in Boston and Pennsylvania, California, and a number of other locations that have really created a lot of anxiety. But for a lot of the country, your construction zones may not be shut down. Your supply lines may be impacted, but can you go somewhere else and get those products? You have a duty to mitigate. You have a duty to look elsewhere. And I hate to say it, it may be more expensive. It may be less convenient. But if there's another option, that's going to have to be part of this inquiry concerning force majeure. Palmer, can you give me the next slide, please? Okay, so you're all sitting there and you're saying, I understand that, that's the legal stuff, but is COVID-19 a force majeure event? And if so, what are my remedies? If I was sitting there in the audience, that's exactly what I'd ask. Next, please. Well, the answer, as I said, it's not something you can turn to a case book or common law. And if you have a remedy, it's going to depend on the unique terms of your contract. And those terms are going to be interpreted in the context of the law that applies to your contract. And that's important because each state has generally different laws that apply to the provisions. Unfortunately, and maybe that's, for us lawyers, we all have 50 different states, and different states look at different requirements differently. So it's going to be those terms and how they're interpreted in your state or by a local government or the federal government. Of course, government contracts has developed its own unique body of laws, and there are a lot of matters that the federal government treats on a very large scale. So those are important points. Palmer? Okay, so another thing to recognize is if the doctrine of force majeure applies, what are my remedies generally? Well, if you look only at that clause, and we're going to look at some other provisions, some other common law doctrines that you should be aware of in a minute, but if you look just at your force majeure clause, as Brian will explain in a minute, most of those clauses are going to allow for you to get time extensions and remission of liquidated damages while that event is impacting you. Very few provisions are going to expressly allow for recovery of your costs associated with the delay. And that's a big deal because we all know time is money. Palmer? Okay, we're in the midst of this crisis, and now I'm going to bring up what you might consider to be a technicality, but it's a real important one. Is there a deadline to act to take advantage of the force majeure clause in your contract? And in most cases, the answer to that is yes. You might think, well, everyone's got constructive notice, or we're all on notice about this national emergency. Why should I have to do something specific to tell somebody, the owner, or if you're a supplier or a subcontractor, why should I have to tell the general contractor something they already know? Well, almost all contracts and these clauses typically contain a notice requirement, and that notice typically says that the requirement to give written notice of the event has to run from the inception of the event. So that's a big deal, and these notices don't have to be overly precise or overly lengthy, but be aware of the notice requirements of putting that entity to whom you're going to submit your claim or look for compensation, give them the written notice that your contract requires. Next, please.
Yeah, Gary, if I may. Sorry about that.
You may, but that's an echo chamber. Go ahead. Was that Brian?
Sorry about that. This is Brian. And I just wanted to suggest when you receive notice, you have to be careful on how you respond, because there's a good chance that you don't want to box yourself in with a very strong response to the notice, because you might be making arguments down the road, maybe to your insurance, or if you're general contractor, your owner, when you're receiving notice from a subcontractor or supplier. If you're looking for a sample of a notice letter, I haven't seen a lot of them on the web, but I just saw a really good one that actually was posted by the AGC of Louisiana that is now on the AGC of America's website. And I would suggest you look at that if you're looking for a tool.
Brian, that's a great point. Yeah, I think everybody, we want to keep our knees bent and be able to move pretty quickly to the left or the right on this, because there are developments day to day, minute to minute. And that's an excellent point. You don't want to fire something off and say, this is not a force majeure event, and then find yourself caught kind of in the middle when this progresses down the road. Yeah, if you're an owner or a general that gets a notice, yeah, again, look at your contract, see if you think this fits within the scope of the clause, as Brian just mentioned. And I think it's reasonable, and contractors or whoever submits the notice should be preparing documentation demonstrating that the performance is impossible, that your unique performance on your contract is impossible or just incredibly commercially impracticable. Not just that COVID-19 was a big deal. We all know that. You're going to have to go to that next step. And also, what steps are you taking to mitigate your damages? And if you're looking elsewhere and you're not finding success, document that and request regular updates. And here, I know we had a short call this morning, but Brad, Brian, and I look at this as a time we're all in this together. And although lawyers, we prepare things kind of for the worst case eventuality, negotiation, discussion, working shoulder to shoulder to try to work this out. If an owner knows of supplies that could be obtained somewhere else, we all need to help each other on this. And that's what we mean by regular updates. A good, robust discussion of how we can get through this issue together. Is there anyone else I should consult or notify? Well, yeah, talk to your CFO as well. It may not be intuitive, but some of you may have already done that. Projects, their financing documents can often contain requirements, force majeure, especially project shutdowns and indefinite delays. Could that possibly constitute an adverse change or an event of default under some of the lending agreements that you're operating under? Look at that, be proactive, and respond accordingly. Next, please. Okay. Brian, your turn.
Excellent. So, sorry for the echo before. And I think we should start with a slide before that you have on the screen. Thanks, Greg. So one more thing on the notices I just wanted to add is that you don't want to put too much in the notice because you just don't want to box yourself in. And the facts are evolving so much. You might say something last week that you want to take back. And so how you word it and how you receive it, a lot of times people are going to get notice and it's going to be vague. They're basically going to say, I'm giving you notice that there's something and I'm going to use my full legal rights, but I'm going to give more facts as I receive them and can gather them. So Gary mentioned that we're all in this together, and I will say I have received a lot of emails in the last day or two.
Hey, Brian, Greg Sizemore, let me ask you to lean in. We're getting comments that they cannot hear you. Can you lean into your microphone? Thank you.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes, proceed.
Sorry about that. All right, so we're all in this together, and then there's the contracts. I'm a big fan of not putting the contracts in the drawer at any time because you need to train your folks for project success and you need to know what's in your contract. And one of the biggest problems I see is people don't read their contracts and then they get stuck in the eight ball. We're behind the 8 ball. I'm a big fan of standard construction contracts, and that's what I do on a daily basis. I help create consensus docs documents. That is a coalition effort. That includes CURT. The American Institute of Architects has been publishing standard documents for over 100 years, and on the screen is their force majeure clause. What's interesting is none of the standard documents actually use the term force majeure, but that's essentially what it is. The AIA's language has a catch-all. It doesn't specifically mention pandemics, epidemics, but it has a catch-all of things beyond the contractor's control, ... Guess who determines if it is legitimately beyond the control, causing a delay? Well, it's written by the AIA, and it's determined by the architect. But this language is something you can work with. It does address the situation we're in. Moving to consensus docs, I take a lot of pride in what we provide, and I think you'll see that this is both readable, which is what we try to do, good legal writing should just be good writing. And it's pretty detailed. This is section 6.3. It specifically mentions epidemics. That's significant. In some states, like New York, if you don't specifically mention the cause for the force majeure event, you may not be able to take advantage of the force majeure clause. So it's really good, and going forward, you're going to want to specifically mention things like epidemics. There are other specific events here. Transportation delays. That is interesting because the question is going to be, we saw a lot of delays in the supply chains initially, and some of that was transportation. And if you're going to have to get a separate source, that is something that might, but probably won't fall under that subclause. Last but not least, what we're going to be delving into a little bit is this adverse governmental actions. There's a difference for when you are delayed, when you are making the site safe, you're worried about safety of your employees or people coming on. That's different when the government forces you, what we're seeing now, to not enter the site. Greg, moving on to the next slide, is the engineer's joint contract documents. A little less specific, but specifically mentions epidemics as a reason for force majeure. In all of these clauses, and let's move to the next slide, the FAR clause. This is the Federal Acquisition Regulations, and it specifically mentions epidemics and quarantines. On all of these clauses, they mention an extension of time. When we were debating this for consensus stocks, there was a lot of debate of what do you do when it's nobody's fault? How do you handle it? Well, if you're doing, we're all in this together, what's fair is fair. The owner is not the cause of this delay. So in general, the contractor seeks time, but there's a real question mark about money. And in general, the force majeure clauses do not provide equitable relief for money. But we're in unprecedented times. Brad, let me ask you, actually, if you have a thought on some of the relief on the force majeure clauses.
I do, but I think you'll have to mute your phone. I definitely do, Brian. Oh, I guess it's coming through anyway. Have you muted your phone or your computer? Anyway.
Go ahead, Brad. Go ahead, Brad. You're coming through fine. Proceed.
Okay, great. I definitely have thoughts, and I don't necessarily agree that these clauses don't allow for costs in many cases. If you look at the AIA, for example, on the suspension of work clause, it does provide for both time and money. And as a company, Gilbane tries to negotiate that into any force majeure clauses or suspension clauses. Suspension meaning if there's some hold up in the project that's instituted by the owner as a result of a number of causes, one of which may be a governmental order. But the owners have to understand that the contractors are going to incur a number of costs that are potentially significant, some of which could include demobilization costs, work to secure the site so that it's watertight or that it's not dangerous to the public or something like that during the period when it's suspended. There also may be early termination fees for rental agreements for equipment or other things that were selected for the project if we do have to leave. And just generally carrying on work that might be necessary in order to resume the work. Those are things that we think are reasonable to compensate the construction manager or contractor for, and so that we would look for in our contract provisions. We certainly don't get that in every contract, but we think it's reasonable for owners to recognize those costs are incurred by the contractors and that they should be compensated for it. Anything you want me to continue on that, Brian?
Yes, I'm muting myself now. All right. So there are other clauses in the contracts that we might want to look at, and I think we're going to kind of cover that a little bit later on proactive steps that you might take. Now, one question we have here on our deck is, do I want to invoke the force majeure clause? And is it probably maybe not the right time? Well, one of the things you have to think about is causation. And can you prove, as Gary was talking about, that it wasn't just more difficult, but can I show that this is not just impossible? That's too high of a standard. It's really more about impracticality. But again, like I was saying before with the notice clause, don't be so quick to say this is not qualifying as a force majeure. We are all in this together, is the latest that I'm hearing. And we want to make sure that we have a construction workforce and construction companies, especially the smaller businesses, which is the primary composition of the construction industry. We're going to have to figure this out. And there's going to be insurance, there's going to be legislation. And so don't be so quick to say, no, hey, this is not a force majeure event. And then you have to think to yourself of, if I am invoking the force majeure event, you could, if you're doing it wrong, we do want to at least flag the issue that you're potentially repudiating the contract. And we're going to get, I think, a little bit in suspension and the opportunities or remedies for termination for convenience on the other side. And with that, let me throw it back to Gary to take over the deck. But Greg, move the next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Brad and Brian. All really good points. And yeah, can force majeure event trigger other contract rights and remedies? And as Brad mentioned, another clause that really plays right into this issue, although it's not technically force majeure, again, I say those two words are sort of big words. If we're focusing just on force majeure, we look at that as a remedy maybe of itself, but there's many remedies, as Brad mentioned, and we're going to talk about some more later. Suspension of work. But for AIA contracts, which are, used a lot in the industry, I do bring to your attention that what this suspension of work clause says is that a contractor may terminate the contract if work is stopped for 30 consecutive days through no fault of the contractor for any of the following reasons: issuance of an order of a court or other authority that requires all work to be stopped. Does that sound familiar? An act of government, such as a declaration of national emergency, that requires all work to be stopped. Up to today, or up to about a week ago, I don't think many of us thought of those clauses as very important. But the AIA clause goes on to say that if the contractor cancels in those circumstances, not only does he get paid for the work done to date, but they get the anticipated profit on the work that's not performed. Wow, that's a big deal, isn't it? Something we should all be thinking about if contracts or projects end up having, considerable economic distress. Let's go to the next slide, Palmer. As Brad pointed out, and he's so right to say this, is force majeure my exclusive remedy? And the answer is no. There are a number of other legal theories and remedies, and Brad and Brian and I talked about it this morning, that you ought to be considering as you're looking at the impact of COVID-19 on your particular company and your projects. And here we do turn a little bit to, we turn to the common law, which is generally accepted case law or judicial law, and then statutes in some states. For instance, I know Georgia has a particular statute that deals with acts of God. Louisiana, where I've done a fair amount of legal work, you've got that civil code that seems to spell out everything that is humanly possible. That also addresses some of these issues. So there are some statutes in states that may well give you a remedy. Let's talk a little bit about, just run through them. We could talk the whole day on this if we wanted to, but you know, that notion of you get time but no money. I saw a pop-up here. Well, can you distinguish between compensable events and non-compensable events? Yeah, although we say you may get time, doesn't that really turn the force majeure clause into a no damages for delay clause? And if that's the way we are evaluating it, in many states, there are at least 4 recognized exceptions to no damages for delay clauses. One of them being uncontemplated delays, another exception being delays for an unreasonable length of time that essentially leads to an abandonment of the project. Those might fit. We also look at, as we talked earlier, impossibility of performance. What's the most fundamental requirement for an owner is to provide access to the job site so that a contractor can do its work. Well, what if the job site is unavailable? And that's the circumstance we're seeing here. Do we have a case of impossibility? Possibly. Brian makes an excellent point that most of us evaluate these situations not so much on impossibility, but commercial impracticability. And again, I don't want everyone thinking that's just, oh man, everything's more expensive than it should have been. That's not quite the test. But is it really impracticable now in this commercial environment to continue that project? Frustration of purpose or performance, what that means is this project really now, even though we could commercially complete it, even though we might be able to do it, is the essence of this project so altered either through time or expense that the purpose of the project has been frustrated? Brad brought up the suspension of work clause, and that's, you know, very important that it is a clause that does give owners remedies. Owners might look at their clauses and consider, in the context of the COVID matter, to perhaps issue suspensions of work. It may be an appropriate way to go. It has to be evaluated on both sides. And then also the provisions in your contract, and also just changes in the law. I mean, this might be like you bid a job, you've got certain code requirements that go back at the time your contract was awarded, but lo and behold, a new code comes out. Well, without compensation, you wouldn't be really expecting, I don't think, unless your contract requires it, to perform that additional work. But don't we have a similar situation here? We've got a change in the law. We've got regulations that are now making our contracts more expensive and more timely to perform. UCC remedies. I know a lot of the members at CURT, we talk about this in some of the sessions about not everything is services. There may be aspects of these large, complex construction projects that actually have UCC remedies, sale of good remedies, that have a whole unique body of law that is developed around commercial impracticability. All of those are potential remedies. I will throw out one example of a concern that I think all of us should at least be aware of, is the potential for a governmental defense of sovereign immunity. For those of us that deal in the world of federal government contracts, that could be a big issue. I had a case a few years ago where a contractor was doing work down at the US Naval Base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and the government-wide increased the cost of messing for food. Of course, all the people that were building had to stay there at the naval base, so they all ate at the commissary, and it tripled. And I filed a claim, equitable adjustment, for a change in the contract. Well, the way that got ruled on is that if you read the changes clause, it says the contracting officer may at any time, by written order and without notice to the sureties, make changes in the general scope of the contract. And the way the Armed Services Board decided that case, to my chagrin, was that this wasn't an order by the contracting officer. This was by the U.S. Navy, not particular to my contract, and therefore the defense of sovereign immunity barred a remedy. Well, that brings back memories, and it may be an issue that we contend with respect at least to federal government contracts. Are these impacts covered by insurance? Hugely important topic. Discussed that with Brad and Brian. We feel that it's such an important topic that that's something that everyone that's impacted should be discussing this with their insurance brokers and agents, with the prospect of whether COVID-19 is an occurrence triggering coverage under one of your policies.
Can I interrupt here, Gary, for a minute? This is Greg Sizemore. For Brad and for Brian, I know we're asking you to look into the crystal ball. What do you anticipate the answer might be on this particular issue? Because I think this is a big one. Thoughts?
Do you want me to go first, Brian?
Sure.
The answer is I don't know. We're looking at a number of things and talking with our brokers about it. One thing that might be useful is business interruption insurance. That might be useful for the owners. Also we carry a lot of contractor controlled insurance programs, and it's not designed for this, and I'm not sure whether, if there's no property damage that goes with it or a loss that's like that, whether there will be coverage or whether it constitutes an occurrence. So honestly, I don't have the answer yet, but we're very interested in that answer. I'll defer to you, Brian.
This is Brian chiming in. What I've heard is that the insurance companies have thought about epidemics, pandemics, and even coronavirus. Because remember, even Ebola was a form of a coronavirus, and that some policies specifically exempt coronavirus. And they know that they couldn't handle a global or the entire United States to cover everybody for this, because everybody's going to be making these claims. And so it's going to be interesting to see, one, is the courts, the interpretation from the insurance companies, maybe the courts when this gets litigated, but maybe the government steps in and provides some relief here with some legislation and some funding. I don't know. But the question is that physical damage, even if you have virus particles on your property, I've heard people say, well, that's really more covered under your pollution liability insurance than your property insurance. It's going to be tough, and it's probably going to be litigated.
Well, let's turn to what I think a lot of people are really interested in, Brad, and how about a report from the front lines? Gilbane is out there. We've seen what's happened in Boston, now Pennsylvania, California. Tell us how you're reacting to it, if you would, please.
Well, we've done a number of things, Gary. We've really started fast and furious to developing a whole lot of different notice templates, but stepping back, the first thing we want to do is make sure that people on our job sites are safe, or in our offices are safe, and we're sending people to work at home wherever possible. We've got internally a coronavirus task force, which has senior leadership, both operational and management, executive management. And we've created a coronavirus hotline internally so people can report or ask questions or whatever they need to do regarding their projects. We've, related to related to the discussion this morning, we've pulled out all of our contracts for ongoing projects, and we're examining whatever language is in them, whether it's force majeure in the instances where, like Boston, Philadelphia now, Bay Area, and I just understand there might be one in New York as well, I believe New York State. Then we're really just finding out what our remedies are, what we need to do in terms of notices to the owner, how we can make sure that the jobs are left in a safe condition. Just going back to the suspension discussion before, I believe it was Gary talking about our right to, the contractor's right to terminate the contract after a period of time. I just want to clarify, at least for Gilbane, I think it's true of other companies, we don't want to do that and look for a windfall of anticipatory profits. We want to build the project, and we want to work with our owners to get that job done when the time comes to resume work. And so we're going to put the project in whatever position it needs to be in so that when that time comes, we're ready to go out and mobilize our forces and our trade contractors. We do have some serious concerns about the condition of the trade contractors after they weather this, whether financially they can weather it, whether they have insurance in place, whether they have the manpower at that point, whether or not people have moved on to other things when they can't work on a construction project or can't work anywhere else. So those are some of the things we're doing. Some of the notices are, for the owners, we have to go to the contracts for those specific projects and see what to do. With the subs, in addition to them securing their work and maintaining their insurance on the projects during any shutdown period, we're also, having them report to us if they have, for jobs that are ongoing, we have them reporting to us if any of their workforce has been exposed, if anybody is exhibiting symptoms. We're posting at every job site and giving notices to all subs. Don't come to the job site if you have any kind of fever or other condition that could reflect, some infection there. Going back to the contract documents, the AIA, as we said, does call for cost and time, where it's just a time extension. That's important too, particularly on jobs that have liquidated damages or other not penalties, of course, but liquidated damages as a result of failing to meet the milestones. We're certainly going to need to have those milestones pushed so that we don't incur those costs. I did want to mention, though, that there are some state statutes that do provide relief. I think you mentioned, Gary, the FAR, subject to the sovereign immunity and other issues. But, for example, in Massachusetts, if the job is suspended as a result of a governmental order, if it's a public job, at least, then, for example, Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 30, Section 39.0 has provisions for the contractor to seek additional time and money, or at least compensation for the shutdown. I guess the time will come if it's resumed. But going back to what I said before, we really do want to build these projects, and we want to work with the owners on our jobs to figure out the best way to get that job done eventually. And we hope the owners will work with us to let us know what the status is from their perspective. If for some reason there's some funding issue that arises during the course of a delay or a shutdown, we need to know about that. If we need to make other arrangements, we certainly want to be in constant communication with the owners so we know the status of things and so we can plan ahead just like the owners want to plan ahead.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to mention is that, where we have had instances, and we've had a few, and we operate in 40 US states and 15 countries overseas. So we've had a range of types of issues arise depending on the location and what the states are doing. And as you've seen, there's a range of things that either states are doing or are not doing. We've had some instances where we've had expected exposure on the job site or someone who we think may have been infected going to a job site. And so what we've done in those instances, we have a subsidiary called Gilbane Reconstruction Services, which is, it's designed for helping owners with, or property owners with major losses from disasters or anything like that, property damage. And we've had that entity go in and clean. We have an arrangement with Service Master as our partner who goes in and they hit the job to disinfect and really do a good job to make sure it's at least surface-wise safe. Of course, as soon as you bring one person back onto the job site who's infected, all that goes to hell. But it is at least a way to ensure that for the immediate future, you can go back and continue work on that site. Brian or Gary, are there any other specific things you'd like me to respond to or talk about?
Well, let's see. Let's go to the next slide, and that might get a little participation from all of us, but especially Brian. You know, we've been looking at our existing contracts, and that's a arm load right there. But I assume and imagine that some of our audience is right in the midst of negotiating future contracts. And what do you do about this COVID-19 now that we're aware of it? You know, up to this point, we've been talking about this is something that wasn't foreseeable and we need to get relief from it. But here we're right in the midst of it, and it's actually been declared a national emergency. So what, if anything, should you do about those new contracts? Brian?
Sure.
Talk to us about that if you would.
So, you know what's foreseeable now is the coronavirus and similar type of viruses. So it's a whole new world order as we're going forward. Before delving into that, I just wanted to piggyback off of something that both Gary and Brad said about the AIA documents on the suspension for 30 days and getting lost profits and overhead on work not performed. So I just have to start out with saying, in my opinion, one of the biggest misnomers out there is that the AIA contract documents are friendly to the owner. That's an example where that is something you've probably changed if you've negotiated and read that clause. But even if you have that clause, that's probably something, as Brad indicated, you're probably going to negotiate with. In the consensus docs, there is the right for the contractor to terminate, but it doesn't give profits for work not performed. It covers things like DMO, things covered insurance. And then yes, there is potentially a premium, but not for something where it's such almost like a windfall for work not performed. So that's something you're going to negotiate. What you are going to negotiate going forward is looking what's in your force majeure clause. And there are some other clauses that both in your existing contract and contracts going forward you're going to look at. One is price escalation. So apparently that is something that people are going to look to more and more. And let me reference that there is a consensus docs addendum, the 200.1, that provides for both an escalation and de-escalation of costs for materials that are highly volatile. And that's advantageous for owners because you don't want to overpay for people putting in a premium that's anticipated that then doesn't happen. So you can actually have prices go down. And that is something that creates for better equity in trying to price things as we look to a very volatile future. And I'll just say, if you want a sample of that, you can just get it for free by going to consensusdocs.org and you can download 3 samples. And that's something you're going to be looking to. You're going to want to look at things like escalations. You're going to look at things like changes in the law. When we're looking at a clause in consensus docs, you can actually get an equitable adjustment for changes in the law. And you might want to change the definition of a change in the law for any action by a governmental authority with jurisdiction. Those are the kind of things that people are seeing. Also, you want to look in your contracts both here and in the future on your safety and welfare clause. If you have to stop work, as Brad mentioned, because your workers aren't safe or you need to secure it, then that's something you're going to want to consider. What are your remedies in potentially getting both time and money for something like that to make sure that you're safe. And I think the slide just, if we could go back to the list here for a sec. Just remember when we're looking at our clauses going forward, both existing and going forward, is your workforce is going to be less efficient. And there are going to be claims for delays if you have to accelerate to make up for the time that you've lost to meet your schedule, there are going to be potential claims beyond some of the things that we've talked about, especially if you haven't set the GMP or your existing contracts. That is something that people are looking at right now and something you're going to have careful attention to, in addition to maybe, again, beefing up your current force majeure clause. So I think that we're interested in getting to questions, and we can maybe go to the question slide. One last point I want to make on the price escalation clause, though, is that it usually covers materials. It usually doesn't cover labor, but that might be something that you want to make as something we tell are going for.
Okay, this is Greg Sizemore. Yes, we do have some questions, and we certainly want to make time for that. One of our attendees asked the following question: what happens if there is no force majeure clause in a contract? What are the likely consequences of that?
I could start with that.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Just remember, even without a force majeure clause, there's, by common law, I think Gary covered this, about impracticality and infeasibility. There's a case in which there was I believe it was a hotel that was supposed to make a hallway available, and then it burned down, and therefore they couldn't perform. So force majeure is considered a gap filler, is what it's termed at. And so even without a force majeure clause, you do have some remedies.
Brian will ask you to lean forward into your computer. I suspect we're not picking up audio real strong. Maybe you're leaning back in your chair.
All right. So there's a gap filler. I'm getting a lot of feedback, actually. So without a force majeure clause, you still have equitable remedies for impracticality and feasibility. Other people have comments?
Another question we have, and again, for those of you posting questions, we will get your question answered one way or the other. We will make sure that you get this slide deck. We will also make sure you get the contact information for those who are presenting. And Rana DeBro, our member services rep, is on the line as well, and she'll make sure your questions get answered. One of the questions also, gang, is that what is the difference between work being stopped and force majeure? How do you bridge those two? Is a work stoppage an applied force majeure, or is there other action required? Comments?
Oh, yeah, this is Gary. I think I was locked out. Well, the force majeure has to look at those elements that we looked at before. It has to be an unforeseeable event. It doesn't necessarily have to stop your work entirely. I think, as Brad mentioned, even on projects that are impacted in New York, Pennsylvania, California, Boston, elsewhere, there's an obligation to secure the site, keep a workforce there, keep an eye on the cranes and other heavy equipment. And so you probably will never see these sites completely abandoned, but also there's that duty to mitigate. So it's a multi-part test if you're looking only at the force majeure clause and try to determine, is this event truly impacting your project in that unforeseeable way?
Yeah, I agree with that. The one thing I would say is that it's not always that it's unforeseeable in a force majeure. It depends on the contract provision. We could foresee a hurricane is likely in the Gulf Coast, but still that's a covered force majeure event under many contracts, because it may be a force 5 or it may be a force 4 and it's dramatic. But even on a smaller one, if it impacts it and it's not normal weather, weather is often a force majeure event that's listed, and it's the extremity of the weather that plays into it. So foreseeability, I think, is variable versus depending on the contract provision.
By the way, I'll remind those who are still on the bridge that in the chat box, you can ask questions of each other as well as of the presenters, and each of you has the option to respond. Somebody, I think, asked about how this is going to play out with OSHA. And actually, we have a future webinar. I think it's August or April the 2nd or 3rd on this very subject, how OSHA applies to COVID-19 implications on the job site as well as on other drug testing provisions. A lot of times people have projects have suspended their drug testing requirements. What impact does that have? And what's OSHA's view? How do you change corporate policy? So I think that was Susan Gold, perhaps, or Brock. Brock, also, yes, you can make this presentation available to your legal teams. And as we mentioned, we'll give you the contact information for every presenter as well. If you have a question, are there any other questions in the chat box to our presenters that you would like to address? There's several of them over there. And as I mentioned, we will make sure that every question gets answered after this event. Ernie Drott had an interesting presentation. Just found out Ernie Drott with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, COVID-19 caused impacts are considered reportable by OSHA, which should or could impact insurance premiums. Any thoughts on that, gang?
There's legislative developments about that. I don't know if you can hear me now. I switched to my computer mic. But
yes, we got you. Keep going.
Yeah, so there's been huge developments with that as a result of some lobbying efforts that it's no longer necessarily a reportable event, and it's really hard to know whether the coronavirus was picked up by the work or your home, and there's a lot of implications for your insurance premiums, and so I believe that it's not as reportable as what first came out from OSHA. Greg, I think we lost your audio.
There we go. Rob Wagner from Procter & Gamble also had an interesting question. What consequences or impact implications, such as self-quarantining as emergency, I mean, is that also defined as an emergency in today's parlance? And does this change the legal aspect or responsibilities when people feel they need to self-quarantine for whatever reason? Great question, Rob Wagner, Procter & Gamble. The gang want to tackle that one?
I guess to understand it, I guess I would say if it's a project-wide self-quarantining, that would be one thing that impacts the availability of labor or project management or whatever else needs to be on site. If it's a few here and a few there and it doesn't create a delay situation because there's other manpower that can fill in the gap, that wouldn't be something that would fall into the force majeure or others. But if the entire job site is affected and can't work and we can't get alternative labor because the rest of the community is in the same situation, that could fall into a force majeure situation or an impracticability or impossibility situation.
And again,
thanks for that. Let me remind, if I may interject, it is 12 noon. We want to be respectful of the time of those who plan just an hour. If there are additional, if the presenters can stay on a few more minutes longer and additional questions, we invite you to do so. But for those who need to click off and go on to other business, it's now 12 noon and we want to certainly give you the go ahead to do so. If you'd like to stay on for a few more minutes, I think the speakers will prevail for another 5 or 10 minutes and we can try to get your question answered. At this point, if you'd like to ask a question versus me monitoring the chat box, I'll just ask whoever is still on the bridge to activate their microphone, ask the questions, and if you're not speaking, please deactivate your microphone. Are there other questions from the 60 or so of us who are left? Other questions that you'd like to ask our presenters? Simply activate your microphone and go ahead and ask. Okay. Hearing none, looking through the questions real quick. Ernie Drott from CORE asked, did the COVID-19 legislation for recordable illness? Sorry about that. Ernie Drott asked,
Lost you again, Greg.
Ernie Drott asked, I'm sorry, from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, did the COVID-19 legislation for recordable illness get passed? Anybody have any update on that?
This is Gary. I don't, but Greg, you might mention to the audience on this question and the prior one, I do think on next Tuesday, you're holding another webinar that deals with a lot of these labor and employment questions that have come up. Isn't that right?
Correct. You're exactly correct, yes. In fact, let me take a moment to mention that for those who are still on the bridge, next Tuesday, the 24th at 10 a.m., project employment issues during the fast-changing COVID-19 landscape. That'll be a presentation, an hour-long presentation with one presenter at this point, next Tuesday, March 24th. So registration information will also be available in our follow-up communications to this webinar. The target is to have those to you before close of business today. Gary, you were going to comment? Go ahead.
Oh, I don't have a precise answer to that other than that can get answered on Tuesday. If those that are asking, I would only be hazarding a guess there. But some of these other questions, and Brian made a good point about these different, diseases, and I do a lot of work defending Legionnaire's disease cases, and it's very similar. It's a long incubation period, a lot of places to potentially be exposed, and it's a very complex issue of causation when it comes down to those issues. And that issue of self-quarantining, I asked that directly to one of my labor and employment partners, and he told me that there's a big risk that employers typically could discharge somebody if they're self-quarantining.
Wow.
So it's a real quagmire out there. But I know that on Tuesday, I believe Rob Dustin would be prepared to answer all of those questions, or certainly address them, because there's a lot of imponderables created by this pandemic.
Yeah, and in addition, somebody brought up the OSHA regulations as they are as COVID-19 is affecting OSHA regulations. Rob Fisher at our office informs me it looks like we've got one firmed up for March the 31st. More information, again, will be coming out to each of our attendees and to our members. Is there another question before we log off here that anybody from the audience would like to ask, either in the chat box, which we're trying to monitor, and also if you want to just activate your audio, we're down to fewer than 50 people right now. You can certainly activate your audio and ask away. We'll pause just another moment. Okay, let me conclude our time together with just a couple of brief announcements. As we mentioned, the next week's webinars, and they will be on Tuesday and Thursday, project employment issues arising during the fast-changing COVID-19 landscape. It's been referenced. Next Tuesday at 10 a.m., slight change in our time frame. And then next Thursday on March the 26th, you won't want to miss Anirban Basu. I talked to Anirban yesterday. His group, the SAGE Policy Group, and by the way, Anirban is one of the leading economists that interpret economic data, trends, and does analysis for the construction industry. If you've been to our national conference, you know Anirban. He's going to be with us next Thursday, the sole presenter, on March 26th at 11 o'clock, talking about the economic impacts, both personally to us, as well as its impact on our construction industry. And I will tell you in advance, you don't want to miss either of those two. I also alluded to one coming up on OSHA and safety issues. We also have one, I think, that's being developed on preparing for project demobilization, what you need to know and watch outs. These are all, again, to service you, our CURT members, during this time of crisis. CURT office is open, regular business hours 9 to 5. Phones have all been directed to those who are working remotely. I happen to be in the office today, along with our production team, Greg Palmer and Kyle Costco. If you have suggestions for future webinar topics, please email those to our CURT office on CURT.org, the website. You'll find contact information. You will also find that same information on follow-up communication. The slide deck that you just experienced will be available to you. This event was recorded. And we're trying to figure out what the best way and policy is to get out the recording of this event. Also, an important announcement that our May General CURT membership meeting is on, but it will be virtual. And we're working with consultants as well as our in-house staff to deliver a seamless virtual experience for those of you who are joining us in May. I think that's it, other than to tell you to follow us on social media. We're on all the primary social media outlets: Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. I'd also like to thank our speakers. These fellas, Brian Perlberg, of course, Gary Ballard, and Brad as well from Gilbane, Brad Gordon, they all joined us on very short notice. And I think it's a testament to their organizations, Consensus Docs, of course, Saul Ewing, and Gilbane Building, who's been a longtime supporter of CURT. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Gary, for your dedicated service, not only to this organization, but to our industry. With that, we will bid you adieu, invite you to keep safe, take care of yourself, and take care of each other. Thanks for joining.